So there will be no class tomorrow afternoon. So tomorrow afternoon is actually a good time to get started on your paper. And I think maybe the most important thing that you can do for this paper is to find a good source to write about. So this paper is really a current events paper, right? Where I'm going to ask you to write 2 to 3 pages in which I'm going to ask you to use class material to analyze a current events article. Now, the most important thing, as I said, to doing this writing assignment well is to find the right article, okay? It has to be related to macroeconomics, okay? Let me emphasize that again. It has to be related to macroeconomics. It has to be related to one of those 6 big questions that we talk about in our syllabus. So, I don't want to see any papers on the supply and demand for lumber, right? Or no papers on what's happening to oil prices, right? I mean, only in the context that it should be talking about something related to macroeconomics, meaning inflation, unemployment, GDP, international trade, fiscal policy, monetary policy, recessions, those kind of questions, right, should be what you're going to focus on. And so all I'm asking you to do is to find an article related to macroeconomics, provide a brief summary of that article, and then analyze that article using class material. So your target audience, who's your audience for this? It really should be one of your classmates. Can you take this article and explain what's in the article using the tools that we've developed in this class? If you can do that, that's an A paper, right? That's really what I'm going to be looking for. If you can do that, and then you can express yourself clearly, right? So to that end, I hope that the objective of the paper is pretty clear. And in my experience, the students who spent a little bit of time looking for papers, for articles, and have found the right articles, if you find the right article, then your paper will kind of write itself, quite honestly, right? Because it will be clear to you what you need to talk about. So Brenna, no, I don't have an assignment sheet other than what I have on the syllabus. So on the syllabus, there's a kind of a 1-paragraph description of this, and so that's basically what I have for this. Where should you look for articles? Within reason, I think there's a lot of places. I always look at The Economist magazine. I think that's a really great place to look for articles. Of course, you can look at Wall Street Journal, New York Times, Washington Post. For that matter, you can look at the Iowa City Press Citizen, right? Yahoo News, Google News, right? I mean, I'm not really particularly picky about where you get articles, as long as they're related to macroeconomics, right? As long as they're related to macroeconomics. One of the things I would like to suggest to you then is after the exam tomorrow, you begin looking for articles, right? And as you find articles, send them to me. I'm happy to, if you find 2 or 3 articles and you're not really sure which one works better, or if you're kind of uncertain about whether it's appropriate for this paper, send it to me. I'm happy to take a quick look and give you some feedback about what I think, which articles I think would be better in terms of more appropriate for this assignment, and also to give you more to talk about. Okay, and so, but of course, if you send me 3 articles Sunday night, I'm not really going to be able to give you much feedback, right? So the sooner that you identify some articles and you send them to me, the sooner I can give you some feedback. I also want to remind you that the Writing Resource Center is out there for your help. So if you feel like you need to have a little bit of help with your writing, if you feel like you'd like somebody to read through your writing and give you some constructive feedback on kind of grammar and mechanics of writing, yeah, that would be great too. But once again, note that you can't write your paper Sunday night and get feedback from the Writing Resource Center, right? You're going to need to, in the next couple of days, sign up for an appointment and make sure that you get at least a fairly rough draft together before that appointment. So I do encourage you, right? Particularly for those of you who feel like you need maybe a little bit more help with your writing, the mechanics of writing, or you just would like to have another pair of eyes, that make sure that you use the resources of the Writing Resource Center. Okay, what am I missing about the paper assignment? What questions do you have about this?
So you said 2 to 3 pages. Is that like single space, double space? What's your preference for that?
You know, I mean, let's just say reasonably spaced. Reasonably spaced. I think actually what I say in your syllabus, what do I say? Yeah, I say 2 to 4 pages. You know, listen, I'm not going to extremely strictly enforce either of those, but I think if you don't say at least, if you don't say at least 2 pages, there's not really a lot for me to grade you on, right? You have to at least be able to say enough for me to kind of grade you on. So let's just say reasonably spaced, right? Let's just say reasonably spaced. Also, let me say that if you find it useful to provide graphs, by all means, put a graph in here. And it does not have to be a professional quality graph. If you just draw it nicely on a piece of paper and attach it to your file, that would be awesome, right? And that, you know, they say that a picture is worth 1,000 words, and in economics, that is certainly true, right? So in some sense, one way to make sure that you don't go over this page limit is to use some graphs. They're a very efficient way of conveying a lot of information. So yeah, use some graphs, but they don't have to be, you know, professional quality, right? I mean, just sketching something out, taking a picture of it, that's more than enough for me. Okay. You should also make sure in your paper cite the article that you're using and any sources. If you refer to sources in your article or in your paper, you should cite those.
Do you care if it's in MLA
yeah.
or? Oh, sorry.
No.
Same question. You're good.
Don't care.
Okay.
Different disciplines have different attitudes toward this. Like in English, they're really picky. In economics, we don't care, right? Just some style. Use some style that works for you. Anything else? So by all means, you know, and like I said, I think tomorrow afternoon is really a good time to begin working on this. And I haven't really talked much about the paper to this point because quite honestly, I felt like we needed to cover a sufficient amount of material so that you were prepared to write the paper. But I think that's where we are now, right? That we've covered the vast majority of the material in the class. And so, yeah, now's the time to kind of sit down and focus on this. And like I said, if you spend a little bit of time finding the right article, I don't think this should be a particularly time-consuming assignment, right? I really think that you find the right article and you know, largely this, with a little bit of thinking and a little bit of organization of your thoughts, that this should really write itself in some ways. At least that's my hope. Okay. Well, if no other questions, you can always send me emails, right? You can always send me emails or ask me tomorrow in class. Or after class or whenever, or, you know, set up an appointment with me if you want to talk about things.
Do you want in-text citations as well as like a works cited?
Can you say that again? You were kind of garbled.
Do you want in-text citations as well as like a works cited page?
No, you don't have to have in-text citations. I mean, if you're giving a direct quote, you should just make it clear from where it's come from, but no, you don't have to give in-text citations. Okay, let's talk about the exam tomorrow. So just to be 100% clear, what's on the exam? Exam number 2, chapters 9 on economic growth. Chapter 12 on aggregate demand, aggregate supply. Chapter 13 on fiscal policy, and Chapter 14 on the money supply and the Fed. And then finally, inequality. So that is the, that's what's covered on the second exam. Other than that, I really do think that the exam is going to be very similar in form to exam number 1. It's going to be a mixture of, I like to ask definitions. There's going to be some short answers, numerical problems, graphical analysis, that kind of stuff. There will be no, essays or long answer questions. We're going to do the exam in Microsoft Word just like we did last time. That I will send you the document at 9 a.m. and then you send it back to me by 11:30. Right, so 9 to 11:30. Last time, there were a couple of students who pushed the 11:30 cutoff, but I think even in that case, I think the students were really done. They were just kind of checking things over, and so I didn't get the impression that time was a big factor, and I don't anticipate it being a factor this time. I think the exam, I wrote the exam trying to make it roughly as long as the first exam in terms of how long it should take you. And it will be as long as the first exam in terms of number of points. It will once again be worth 100 points. So it'll be worth as much as the first exam. So yeah, my hope is that, once again, you will all have a better idea of what's coming this time, simply because you've had even that much more experience with the kind of questions I like to ask, and hopefully having more experience into how you interpret these questions and just getting more familiar with economics. So any questions about the logistics of the exam tomorrow? Okay, well, if hearing none, then let me just open it up to you. What kind of questions do you have about the material on the exam? What can we go over?
Could you go over an aggregate supply-driven recession again?
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Okay, an aggregate supply-driven recession. The example that we talked about in class was the 70s oil price shocks. Right? And so this was a big increase in the price of inputs. And as we talked about, during the 70s, there were really 3 different oil price shocks in which the price of oil doubled each time. So it doubled in 71, it doubled in 73, it doubled in 79. So this is a big increase in the price of inputs. And as we talked about just this morning, this is a question on quiz number 4, an increase in the price of inputs is one of the things that shifts short-run aggregate supply. Specifically, it reduces short-run aggregate supply. So in terms of aggregate demand, aggregate supply, what impact did this supply-driven recession have? It shifted our short-run aggregate supply curve to the left. And notice by shifting it to the left, it not only caused us to have a recession, it also drove up inflation. And that's not what we usually see when we have aggregate demand-driven recessions. During an aggregate demand-driven recession, aggregate demand goes down, and so output falls, but inflation falls. Here, we see the worst of both worlds. Output fell, but inflation went up. Right? And I think I mentioned that this was referred to at the time, and is still referred to as stagflation, right? Stagnant output growth and inflation. So Logan, I think it was you, Logan, who asked the question. I couldn't actually see, didn't pop up on my screen.
Yeah, it was.
Yeah. So so that would be an example of a supply-driven recession. Now, I guess the other complicating factor here is how should government respond to this? And in that case, it's not clear that the typical tools of Keynesian stabilization policy work. As we talked about, one of the things that, or what the federal government did at the time is because they were very Keynesian and thought about things in Keynesian ways, they tried to increase aggregate demand. Basically, the Fed increased the money supply and tried to increase aggregate demand to drive output up. That was what the Fed did during the 1970s. But of course, while it improved the output problem, what did it do to the inflation problem? It made it even worse. And so this basically contributed to the big buildup of inflation that took place throughout the 1970s. Is the short-run aggregate supply shocks happened first, but then the Fed, trying to increase output, increased the money supply and drove up inflation even more. And in hindsight, it's pretty clear that that was a mistake, that the Fed got too focused on output and they didn't think nearly enough about inflation.
So is the best situation here for the government to remain laissez-faire, like hands-off kind of? I mean, because if you lower the demand, then it would also hurt it.
Right. I mean, so here we have a case where there's no clear Keynesian solution to this, right? I mean, honestly, there's no great solution, at least in terms of typical aggregate demand management. So, I mean, I guess I would tend to agree with you, Zach, that if you can't make something better, don't make it worse. So, you know, I guess my attitude would have been, yeah, it would probably have been better for the Fed not to do anything. But there's clearly not a great answer here in terms of stabilization policy. So Sonny, you asked a question in the chat. In stagflation, isn't the bigger risk to control inflation? The long-term impact of inflation is worse than a recession. Well, yeah, you know, who agreed with you is the Federal Reserve. Because in 1980, there was a new chairman of the Federal Reserve that was put into place under Ronald Reagan, or actually he was appointed under Jimmy Carter, but most of his term was under Ronald Reagan, and he agreed. He basically said, Paul Volcker was his name, but he basically said the long-term consequences of inflation are worse than a recession. And so what did he do? He came in and he immediately cut the money supply and reduced aggregate demand. And where did we go? Way down into a big recession. But what was the consequences of this? Inflation fell from way up here to way down there. So this is getting to be a very confusing graph, I'm sorry. But yeah, you know, I mean, I think the Fed basically made that decision, is that the long-term impact of inflation is worse than running a recession to get inflation back under control. And so that's what they did. They purposely ran a recession in 1980 and 1981 in an effort to try to get inflation under control. So in hindsight, this was a big mistake in monetary policy, right? A big mistake in monetary policy. And hopefully we understand this a little bit better based on our discussion today, right? A little bit better based on our discussion today. So, as I said this morning, well, what we talked about this morning is not going to explicitly be on your exam. My hope is a lot of what we talked about today really will help us understand some of the things that we talked about that are going to be on our exam. All right, how's that, Logan? Do you feel like you got your question answered?
Yeah, thank you.
Sure. Okay, how about some other questions?
Yeah, I was wondering if you could just list off all the factors that can move aggregate demand and short run aggregate supply.
Okay. I'm trying to remember all of them that we talked about, but I think I can. Some of the important ones is we've talked about changes in consumer confidence that can shift aggregate demand. We've talked about fiscal policy, which includes changes in taxes and changes in government spending. We've talked about monetary policy. Changes in the money supply and changes in interest rates can change aggregate demand. We haven't really talked about this much. We'll talk about this more in the last couple of days of class. The changes in exports and imports can change aggregate demand, right? If exports go up or if imports go down, both of those would increase aggregate demand because exports is selling more abroad and less imports means buying less from abroad. Both of those would increase aggregate demand. What am I forgetting? I feel like I'm forgetting something.
Wealth.
Yeah,
aggregate.
thank you. Yeah, thanks. Changes in aggregate wealth, for instance, like from a market crash or from a market boom. For instance, one of the things that undoubtedly is helping the US economy right now is the big boom in the stock market, right? As the stock market goes up, actually housing market has gone up too. So as the housing market has boomed, as the stock market has boomed, Americans who have wealth in the stock market and the housing market are feeling richer. And when you feel richer, you spend more. So, Krista, this is not an all-inclusive list. I don't want to suggest that these are the only things that shift aggregate demand. But I think these are some of the primary ones that we've talked about, right? These are the primary ones we've talked about. You also wanted to know about things that shift short-run aggregate supply. And I think we listed these this morning, right? Anything that changes productivity, including changes in human capital, physical capital, and technology. They shift both short-run and long-run aggregate supply. Changes in inputs. And then changes in the expected price level and nominal wages. Those are the three things that we talked about that shift short-run aggregate supply. Right, does that answer your question, Krista? Sunny asks, so change in the price level of inputs doesn't change long-run aggregate supply because price level doesn't matter in the long run. Well, it is true that the price level doesn't matter in the long run, right? That's why this is vertical, right? That's the whole concept of money neutrality, that the price level doesn't matter in the long run. But Sunny, I think the other reason why we usually don't think about input prices impacting long-run aggregate supply is because, quite honestly, input prices rise, input prices fall, right? There's a lot of volatility in it. Over the long run, though, they're going to be at their long-run average. And when you're at your long-run average, that's when you're at the natural rate. So when we say changes in input prices, we're really more talking about short-run fluctuations, right? These short-run fluctuations, though, average themselves out in the long run. They average themselves out in the long run, and so in the long run, we always end up here back at the natural rate. So, you know, you might say, when did the, yeah, I guess there's always this dichotomy between thinking about things in terms of the long run and the short run. Somebody asked a question about this the other day in, I think, a review session we had Monday afternoon, trying to make sure that they understood the difference between the long run and the short run. And you know, I think one of the things I said there was the long run is long run average behavior over long periods of time. Short run is deviations from long run average behavior, right? So, you know, it just strikes me that an analogy to be made is, in the long run, the ocean is flat, right? In the long run, the ocean is flat. But of course, if you look at the ocean at any given day, what are you going to see? A lot of ups and downs. And that's pretty much how it is with most things in economics. Yeah, in the long run, on average, economies grow pretty steadily. But from year to year, there's a lot of ups and downs. And those ups and downs in this model are captured by the short run aggregate supply curve. So what shifts long run aggregate supply? Anything that changes productivity, which is the big three: human capital, physical capital, and technology, right? So for instance, an increase in productivity would shift our long run aggregate supply curve, move us to a higher natural rate of output. Right? An increase in productivity driven by, for instance, some new innovation, some new form of technology. So to connect this to chapter 9, what does economic growth look like? Economic growth in the long run is just this. It's our long run aggregate supply going up and up and up, increasing our productive capacity, increasing our natural rate of output. What causes this growth in the long run? Increases in productivity. What drives those increases in productivity? Increases in human capital, increases in physical capital, and increases in technology. Ultimately, what drives more human capital, more physical capital, more technology? Institutions. So you think about institutions setting the stage for us to accumulate. I really should have my arrows moving this way. institutions set the stage for us to accumulate more technology, physical capital, human capital. That then increases productivity and increases growth by shifting our long-run aggregate supply curve to the right. That's how you can connect what we talked about in Chapter 9 to this aggregate demand, aggregate supply model. Sunny asks, this is a good question. In the event of war or famine or large natural disaster, is it possible that the natural rate of output could actually be reduced? For instance, it goes back to where I guess you mean where the natural rate was 10 or 20 years ago because the country is weaker. Undoubtedly. Yeah. I mean, right, we treated this as if growth is like some inevitable thing, right? In part because when you look at the history of US, it is inevitable in the US. One of the things that really makes the US a rich country is that we've had such a long sustained period of growth. But if you look at the rest of the world, right? Like for instance, let's think about Europe, right? You look at World War II, and one way that you could really think about why Europe is poorer than the United States is because World War II was largely fought on European soil, right? And so what did World War II do? It reduced a ton of human capital and it lost a ton of physical capital, right? And what did that do? That really drove long-run aggregate supply way back and reduced the natural rate. And so things like natural disaster or a war can reverse this process of growth. In the US, we've been lucky in that we've had very few big events like that that has significantly impeded our progress of growth. But in other countries, you know, they had bigger events, you know, and if you think about Europe, clearly World War I and World War II were periods of time where they actually had a significant fall in the natural rate of output because of the losses of human capital and physical capital. Good question. Yeah, I hadn't really thought about talking about that, but yeah, I think I'm glad you raised that. What's some other questions?
Can we talk a little bit about the inequality questions you might ask?
So you're going to have to be a little bit more specific than that, Bryn. I mean, do you have something specific that you want to ask about, or?
Not really. I'm just wondering, like, what kind of questions you might ask, like, what to do with inequality, because that's a very broad.
Well, I think, you know, any questions about inequality will relate to my discussion of it, right, in your readings. And I think there were really, in the readings, there were three big questions. What does the data say? Right, what does the data say is happening to inequality? And so we talked about 6 facts. And I'm not going to go through all of those facts again, but we talked about 6 facts talking about how global inequality is actually going down, but domestic inequality is going up in the US. Then we talked about what's driving rising domestic inequality. And once again, I think we talked about 6 or 7 things, I can't remember all of them off the top of my head, that are the causes of rising domestic inequality, including the race between inequality in education. You had a question about that on quiz number 3. We talked about assortative mating. We talked about the economics of superstars. What else did we talk about? We talked about capital accumulation and how if you have wealth, it compounds over time, which contributes to rising inequality, right? Yeah, assortative mating, right? Our dating and marrying preferences have played a role. We talked about the power of elites, right? How increasing wealth in the hands of a small number of people have increased political power, which means that some people then can change the rules of the game in their favor. So these 2 questions are actually what we talked about, right? What we talked about. And so, right. So I would probably ask you questions related to something that has to do with these 2 questions, right? Do you understand what's happening to inequality? And can you say something about what's driving it?
So it'd just be more like a short answer, like explain this kind of deal.
Yeah, we didn't really do any problems-based or graphical analysis kind of questions. All right, who's got some other questions?
I got one.
Yeah.
Well, first of all, do you think like the government spending multiplier, do you think that's something we need to know more than the tax and transfer multiplier?
We talked about both of them, Gabe. You need to know both.
And yeah, so I was just gonna ask if we could do like an example of just one of those.
Of the tax transfer?
Either one, yeah.
Okay, well, let's do a tax. You had on quiz number 4, you did a government spending multiplier question, right? Let's do that same question from quiz number 4. But this time, instead of doing it in terms of government spending, let's do it in terms of tax and transfer. So if you remember quiz number 4, the question was, quiz number 4 was give people an increase in government spending, or give the economy an increase in government spending of $100 billion. Let's do the example of you give people a tax cut of $100 billion. What's going to be the change in GDP? So our maximum tax transfer multiplier is the change in output you get from a change in T. And you just have to, this is one of the things you just have to remember, that the formula is negative MPC over 1 minus MPC. And if you remember in this question, you were given an MPC of 0.8. So really the same question, except now instead of government spending, what's changing is changes in taxes. So you're giving people a tax cut of $100 billion. In other words, the change in transfers is negative $100 billion from the government's perspective. They're getting less, $100 billion less. So if we plug this in to our formula, we want to solve for the change in Y. The change in T is negative 100 billion. And our MPC is 0.4. So we can rewrite this as This simplifies down to negative 0.4. And the change in output is 400 billion. Note how this is a smaller number than we got on the quiz. Right? On the quiz, we found the number was 500 billion. Now it's 400 billion. Why the difference? Well, as we talked about, the government spending multiplier is bigger than the tax transfer multiplier. Because when you give the government the money to spend, they spend every cent. What if you cut people's taxes? Some of it they save, and the rest of it they spend. And so by saving some of it, that minimizes the multiplier effect.
So the answer is it 400 billion?
And for this question, I have it
for the
set-
tax transfer, yeah.
like the way I set this one up, it's 400 billion. Okay, so you good to go, Gabe, on that? Hopefully. All right, who else has a question? Okay, well, maybe we've reached the end here. Let me encourage you tonight. Of course, you know, spend a little bit of time looking over your notes, but, you know, try to figure out some ways to actively study, right? Whether it's making some definition flashcards and testing yourself, whether it's working through a couple of problems, maybe working through a problem with a couple people in class, right? Try to be active in your studying tonight, right? As opposed to just like flipping through all the pages of your notes, right? Because probably by this point in the class, you've got a hell of a lot of pages of notes, right? So yeah, you know, talking about this concept of diminishing marginal returns, right, which is going to be on your exam tomorrow, right, there's diminishing marginal returns to how many times you can look at a page of notes, right? So try to figure out some ways that you can more actively study tonight, right? Whether it's copying notes, like making flashcards, self-quizzes, working through problems, right? Try to overcome diminishing marginal returns and try a couple of different things tonight, okay? If questions come out, you know, you figure out this brilliant question that you need to have answered, by all means, send me an email. I'll be checking my email probably till 9 or 10 o'clock tonight. So I'm happy to try to give you some help. Also, I'll be probably at my computer about 8 o'clock tomorrow morning. So if you have some last minute questions, you can always reach out to me in the morning. If not, I'll expect to see you all back on Zoom at 9, and then we'll send you the exam and we'll take it from there, okay? Okay, all right. Thank you, everybody. Good luck studying tonight. All right, work hard.
Hey, Todd, can I talk to you about something?
Yeah. Hold on one second. Sorry, I couldn't even see who that was speaking.
It's Preston.
Hey, Preston. Yeah, that'd be fine. Gabe and Evan, do you have a question, or you just?
Yeah, I do.
Okay. How about I put you guys in breakout rooms, and then I'll come visit you individually. Okay.
All right.
Okay. I'll be in here in a moment. Hey, Preston, what's up? Oh, wait, hold on.